Here's something nobody talks about. The history you learned in school, half of it never happened the way they told you. And the craziest part? We keep teaching these myths like they're facts, generation after generation. Stick around because what I'm about to show you will change how you see history forever. So look, we trust history books, right? We assume that if something made it into a textbook, or if our teachers taught it to us, then it must be true. But here's the problem. History isn't just facts written down on paper. It's stories. And stories? They change every time someone tells them. Think about it like this. You ever play that game as a kid where one person whispers something to another person and it goes around the circle? By the time it gets back to the first person, the message is completely different. That's basically what happened to a lot of historical events. Except instead of going around a circle of kids, these stories went through centuries, different languages, political agendas, and people who had reasons to change things. And today, we're going to look at some of the biggest myths in history that people still believe. Not just small details that got mixed up. I'm talking about massive events, famous figures, and entire narratives that shaped how we see the world. And once you see how these myths formed, you'll start questioning everything you thought you knew. Let's start with something simple, something everyone knows. Vikings wore horned helmets, right? Wrong. This is one of the most widespread myths in history, and it's completely made up. There's zero evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets in battle. In fact, it would have been incredibly stupid to do that. Think about it. You're in a battle with swords and axes flying everywhere. The last thing you want is horns sticking out of your head, giving your enemy something extra to grab onto or hit. So where did this idea come from? It actually started in the 1800s. Almost 1,000 years after the Viking Age ended. Artists and costume designers started putting horned helmets on Vikings in paintings and operas because it looked cool and dramatic. It made them seem more barbaric and exotic. And people loved it. The image stuck. Now you can't think of a Viking without picturing those horns, even though real Vikings would probably laugh at how ridiculous that looks. But that's just costumes, right? Who cares if we got the helmets wrong? Well, here's why it matters. That fake image of Vikings shaped how we see an entire culture. We think of them as savage barbarians because of images like that. But Vikings were actually sophisticated traders, explorers, and settlers. They had complex laws, art, and social structures. But the myth made them into one-dimensional raiders with horns on their heads. The truth got buried under the fiction. Now let's talk about something bigger. The Middle Ages. You know what most people call them? The Dark Ages. And that name tells you exactly what people think about that time period. 1,000 years of darkness, ignorance, and nothing important happening. Everyone was dirty, nobody could read, and society basically stopped progressing until the Renaissance came and saved everyone. Except that's not what happened at all. The term Dark Ages is itself a myth created during the Renaissance. People in the 1500s and 1600s wanted to make themselves look better, so they trashed the period that came before them. They said, look how enlightened we are compared to those dark medieval times. It was basically a marketing campaign that worked so well we're still using their terminology today. The reality? The Middle Ages had universities, hospitals, and incredible architectural achievements. Those massive cathedrals you see in Europe? They were built during the so-called Dark Ages, and we still can't fully figure out how they did it with their technology. There were advances in agriculture, philosophy, and science. Was it perfect? No, but it wasn't this pit of ignorance we've been told about. And here's another one that'll blow your mind. You know that story about Christopher Columbus proving the Earth was round? How everyone thought the world was flat, and Columbus was this brave genius who proved them wrong by sailing west? Complete fiction. People in 1492 already knew the Earth was round. Educated people had known for over 1,000 years. The ancient Greeks had figured it out and even calculated the Earth's circumference pretty accurately. The flat Earth myth was actually invented in the 1800s by writers who wanted to make a point about religion versus science. They created this narrative where the medieval church taught that the Earth was flat, and brave scientists had to fight against religious ignorance. It made for a good story about progress and enlightenment. The problem? It never happened. The church never taught that the Earth was flat. Columbus never proved it was round. But the myth became so popular that most people still believe it today. So why does this keep happening? Why do these myths survive even when we have evidence showing they're false? There are actually a few reasons, and once you understand them, you'll see the pattern everywhere. First, myths are simpler than reality. Real history is complicated and messy. People's motivations are mixed. Events have multiple causes. It's hard to fit that into a neat story. But myths? They're clean. They have clear heroes and villains, obvious lessons, and satisfying endings. Our brains love that. We're wired to remember stories better than facts. So the simplified myth version sticks in our heads better than the complicated truth. Second, myths serve a purpose. They're not random. People create and spread myths because those myths support something they want to believe or something they want others to believe. That Viking helmet myth made Northern Europeans seem more exotic and fierce. The Dark Ages myth made the Renaissance look better. The Columbus myth created a hero narrative about defying ignorance. Every myth benefits someone. Third, and this is the big one, repeating a myth makes it stronger. Every time someone teaches that Vikings had horned helmets, every time a movie shows Columbus arguing with people about a flat earth, every time someone calls the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, the myth gets reinforced. It doesn't matter if scholars have debunked it. If everyone keeps repeating it, it stays alive. Let me give you another example that shows how powerful this repetition can be. Napoleon Bonaparte. Quick, what do you know about him? If you said he was super short, you just fell for a myth. Napoleon wasn't unusually short. He was about 5'6" or 5'7", which was actually average height for French men at that time. Some sources even suggest he might have been slightly above average. So why does everyone think he was tiny? British propaganda. France and Britain were enemies, and British cartoonists drew Napoleon as a short, angry little man to mock him. They called him Little Boney and showed him throwing tantrums like a child. The propaganda was so effective that it lasted for over 200 years. Even now, when you can look up the facts in about 10 seconds, people still believe Napoleon was short. That's the power of a myth that gets repeated enough times. And it's not just old history. Modern events turn into myths too, sometimes within years or even months. Take the Great Wall of China. Ask anyone, and they'll tell you it's the only man-made structure visible from space. Heard that before? It's everywhere. Tour guides say it. TV shows mention it. It sounds impressive and cool. There's just one problem. It's not true. Astronauts have confirmed over and over that you cannot see the Great Wall from space with the naked eye. It's too narrow and blends in with the natural landscape. You can see cities, you can see big human-made features, but not the wall itself. Yet this myth is so widespread that it's almost impossible to kill. People want to believe it because it makes the wall seem even more impressive than it already is. Here's where it gets really interesting though. Sometimes the myths aren't about what happened, they're about what didn't happen. Let me explain. You've heard of Marie Antoinette, right? She's the French queen famous for saying, "Let them eat cake" when she heard that peasants had no bread. It's the ultimate example of an out-of-touch rich person not understanding how regular people live. Except she never said it. There's no evidence she ever said anything like that. The phrase actually appeared in a book written years before Marie Antoinette could have said it, and it was attributed to a generic princess, not to her specifically. But it got attached to Marie Antoinette because it fit the narrative. She was Austrian, not French. She was seen as extravagant and wasteful. People already didn't like her. So when revolution came, this fake quote made her the perfect villain. It didn't matter that she never said it. The myth was too useful. And this happens all the time with famous people. We attach quotes and stories to them because it feels right even when it's wrong. Einstein never said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. But it sounds like something a smart person would say, so it got attributed to him. We create these myths around famous figures to make them fit the image we have of them. Now here's the scary part. If we got this much wrong about events that happened hundreds of years ago, with written records and evidence, what are we getting wrong about things that happened thousands of years ago? Ancient history is even more filled with myths because we have fewer sources, and the sources we do have often contradict each other. Take the Library of Alexandria. You've probably heard that when it burned down, humanity lost thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, setting back human progress by centuries. It's a tragic story about the fragility of knowledge. But guess what? It's mostly a myth. The Library of Alexandria didn't burn down in one dramatic fire. It declined gradually over centuries. Some books were lost in various fires and conflicts, sure, but it wasn't this single catastrophic moment. And while losing any library is sad, the idea that it set back human progress by centuries is exaggerated. Knowledge doesn't exist in just one place. Important texts were copied and spread to other libraries and cities. But we keep telling the story as this tragic moment because it's dramatic. It's a better story than the library slowly becoming less important over time and eventually fading away. The myth gives us a clear villain, usually religious fanatics or barbarian invaders depending on who's telling the story, and a clear tragedy. The messy reality doesn't fit that narrative. Or how about Cleopatra? Think of Cleopatra and you probably picture an incredibly beautiful woman who seduced powerful Roman men with her looks. That's how movies show her. That's how she's described in pop culture. But ancient sources suggest her real power wasn't her physical beauty. It was her intelligence, charm, education, and political skill. She spoke multiple languages. She was the first in her family in almost 300 years to actually learn Egyptian. She was a skilled negotiator and ruler. But the myth focuses on her beauty and sexuality because that's easier to understand, and it fits old stereotypes about powerful women. We reduce complicated intelligent women in history to just their appearance because the myth is simpler than the reality. Speaking of ancient warfare, let's talk about Sparta. The 300 Spartans at Thermopylae holding off the massive Persian army? That's become the ultimate symbol of courage and military excellence. Movies have been made about it. The story is incredible. But here's what they don't tell you. There weren't just 300 soldiers at Thermopylae. There were actually several thousand Greek soldiers there, including 700 Thespians who stayed and fought to the end alongside the Spartans. But we only remember the Spartans. Why? Because Sparta had excellent PR. They cultivated this image of themselves as the ultimate warriors, and that myth survived for thousands of years. Were they good soldiers? Yes. Were they the unstoppable warriors the myths make them out to be? Not really. Athens defeated Sparta in several battles. But the myth of Spartan invincibility was so strong that we still use them as the symbol of military excellence today. And Sparta itself? The way they actually lived? It was brutal. They enslaved a huge portion of the population. They killed babies they deemed weak. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and put through harsh training. It was a society built on fear and violence. But the myth polishes all that away and gives us this image of noble warriors with a perfect military society. The reality was way darker than the legend. This brings up something important. Myths don't just change what we know about the past. They change what we think is possible in the present and future. If you believe the myth that the Dark Ages were a time when humanity stopped progressing, then you might think progress is fragile and can easily be lost. If you believe myths about lone heroes overturning accepted knowledge, you might apply that logic to deny real science today. Myths shape our worldview. They create patterns we expect to see repeated. They give us heroes to emulate and villains to avoid becoming. But if those myths are based on things that never actually happened, we're building our understanding on sand. And here's maybe the most frustrating part. Even when historians correct these myths, even when the evidence clearly shows something is false, the myths survive. You can find the truth with a quick internet search. Experts have written countless books debunking these stories. But the myths persist because they're already embedded in our culture. They're in movies, books, school lessons, and casual conversations. Correcting them feels like fighting an ocean with a bucket. So what do we do about this? How do we separate history from myth when they've gotten so tangled together? First, we have to accept that history is always being rewritten. Not because historians are making things up, but because we keep finding new evidence and new ways to interpret old evidence. What we think we know about the past is always provisional. It's the best explanation we have right now with the evidence we have now. Second, we need to ask who benefits from a particular historical narrative. When you hear a story about the past, especially one that seems too neat or has a clear moral lesson, ask yourself who this story serves. Does it make a particular group look good or bad? Does it justify current beliefs or power structures? If a myth serves a purpose, that's a red flag that it might not be entirely accurate. Third, look for complexity. Real history is complicated. Real people have mixed motivations. Real events have multiple causes and effects. If a historical story is too simple, if everyone fits neatly into hero or villain roles, if there's one clear cause and one clear effect, you're probably looking at a myth rather than history. The truth is usually messier. Because here's the thing, history matters. Not just as trivia or interesting stories, though those are fine too. History matters because it shapes how we understand ourselves and our world. If we believe myths about the past, we'll make decisions in the present based on false information. We'll repeat mistakes because we never learned the real lessons. We'll miss opportunities because we think something's impossible when history actually shows it's been done before. The Vikings didn't need horned helmets to be interesting. Their real history is way cooler than the myth. The Middle Ages don't need to be dark to make the Renaissance bright. Both periods had achievements and problems. Columbus doesn't need to have proved the Earth was round to be significant. His voyages changed the world, for better and worse, regardless of that myth. When we strip away the myths, we don't lose the power of history. We gain something better. We get the truth. in all its complicated, messy human reality. And that's way more valuable than any myth could ever be. The real history shows us that progress isn't linear, that great civilizations can have terrible practices, that underdogs don't always win, that heroes are flawed and villains are human, that massive changes often happen gradually rather than in dramatic moments. These lessons are harder to digest than simple myths, but they're the lessons we actually need. So next time you hear a historical fact that sounds too perfect, too simple, or too convenient, do yourself a favor and dig a little deeper. You might find that the real story is different from what you were told. And yeah, sometimes that's disappointing. Sometimes we want our heroes to be perfect and our stories to be simple. But more often, the truth is actually more interesting than the myth. History isn't a set of agreed-upon facts that never change. It's an ongoing conversation about what happened, why it happened, and what it means. Myths try to end that conversation by giving us simple answers. But real history keeps the conversation going by admitting what we don't know and always staying open to new evidence. And that's what separates history from myth. Myths are fixed. They resist change because changing them means admitting they were wrong. History is flexible. It changes as we learn more, and that's its strength, not its weakness. When you understand that difference, you can start seeing through the myths to the history underneath. If this made you rethink what you know about history, hit that subscribe button.